Corsets, an undergarment that prevailed in many shapes and forms for more than 400 years in Europe, and periodically still makes comebacks in contemporary fashion. What was their purpose? Purely fashionable, practical garments, or a device of the patriarchal oppression? Let's learn a little bit more about this overlooked attire. About a year ago, I developed a new hobby for sewing. And my main source of information about that was YouTube. I started to learn more about historical fashion. One of the things that surprised me the most as I learned about the historical costuming was the very strong opinions that people on these channels had about corsets. They all seemed to be very adamant on kind of protecting their reputation. As this intrigued me, I decided to take a closer look about corsets by doing a little research on their general history. Before starting, here are some vocab words that could be helpful and that I'm going to be using talking about corsets. Eyelets are the holes that are pierced through clothing or leather and that are used to tighten a garment. Whalebone is the kind of tea-like substance that a whale grows to filter out plankton, and whalebone was used by corset maker to stiffen corsets. Featherbone was an alternative to whalebone, so featherbone was made from the quills of feathers that were all tied together into long strings. It is hard to trace back the exact beginning of when people started wearing a structured garment. Some corset-like garments were even found on figurines dating back to the 17th century before Christ, but the origin of corsets as we know them dates back to the 16th century Italy. Quick side note here, corsets were actually called stays for up to about the beginning of the 19th century, but for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna use stays and corsets as synonyms. The type of corset at the time was a very conical piece of clothing that gave the impression of a very flat bust and an elongated body, which served to balance the very conical shape of the stiff skirts. This very flat front was achieved by using a busk. A busk was the rigid element at the front of the corset. In the earlier days, it was made of wood, ivory, or bones, and later steel. The trend of these stiff bodices was then brought from Italy to France by Catherine de Medici, and would then spread to the rest of Europe. In England, Queen Elizabeth was the one who adapted the fashion into the very recognizable Elizabethan silhouette. This very elongated shape continues to prevail throughout the 16th and 17th century. During the 18th century, we can see a transition from the very conical fashion to a garment that would slowly start to emphasize more of the natural waist rather than a very artificial waist, with stays getting a lot shorter and a lot smoother. These garments were meant to push up the bust more than to reduce the waist, as the eyelets that were used to lace the stays were hand sewn and thus could not take much strain before tearing the fabric. Some stays of that era came with attached sleeves and some were heavily decorated, as these pieces were often seen as the outerwear. By the end of the 18th century, stays had become heavily boned and shaped the recognizable silhouette of that era, with the shoulders thrown back and a high posture. The Regency era refers to a period in England between 1795 and 1837. This period, although it's short, is meaningful because of the massive change that the fashion saw in its silhouette. During the Regency period, fashion took after two major events. First, the neoclassicist movement in arts, which took inspiration from the antiquity and sought after natural fashion and pure lines. The second event was the French Revolution and the desire to strive away from the traditional silhouette which was linked with the monarchy. These two events brought the fashion of having dresses that revealed more of the natural body, with skirts that were very slim compared to other eras. There were also a rise of the waistline up to the underbust, and in this optic the corsets had to change a lot too to accommodate for the new fashion. And so we see a lot of transitional corset all around the 1800s to the 1820s. The Victorian era refers to the reign of Queen Victoria between 1837 all the way to the 1900s. In the 1830s and early 1840s, corsets are still transitioning from the very soft, the corded Regency stays to the more waist-defined and rigid corsets of the later periods. The waist also gradually got smaller through the 1840 to the 1860s. The fashion of the 1860s particularly was characteristics of a very tiny waist, as well as huge skirts, big sleeves, and enhanced shoulders, which helped to further sell the illusion of having a very tiny waist. This fashionable silhouette was made possible through two major inventions. First, the metal eyelets, which would now allow the laces in the back of the corsets to be pulled tighter. The other invention was the crinoline. A crinoline, or hoop skirt, is a structured petticoat that was made mostly with steel. These inventions, as well as other changes in the silhouette, leads us to the 1880s and 1890s, with the classical Victorian silhouette. This silhouette was characterized by a very fitted bodice as well as an hourglass figure. The corsets of that period are also the ones that are mostly referenced today in collective imagery. The Edwardian corsets saw yet another change in silhouette. This change actually stemmed from the desire to find a healthier, fashionable shape. The new corsets had a very straight bust instead of the curved bust from before, which prevented the pressure on the internal organs that previous corsets might have caused. It was also a lot longer in order to push the lower belly back and behind and thus bring the chest upwards. This new silhouette was called the S-curved. The Edwardian corsets were very curvy but still required a lot less bone than their predecessor. This was thanks to the very skilled corset maker and corset pattern maker. These people were able to cut the fabric in a way that when sewn together, it would already have a very strong shape. To get from the 1900s to the 21st century, there is a lot of history that we have to skip here. The undergarments have gone through a lot of change, going from the very structured corsets to almost no undergarments. Corsets, although they are very less frequent now, are still an important part of modern culture. Designers such as Vivienne Westwood and Jean-Paul Gaultier have used corsets and the imagery of corsets in many ways in their collections and runway fashion. Pop singers also frequently wear corsets on stage, as well as influencers, and more recently maybe, corsets have caught up on the more large fashion trends. The trend caught up to the point where Adidas recently released a kind of corseted top. So we've seen that corset I've been around for a very long time and that they've evolved a lot. But the perception of corsets that we now have is filled with a lot of myths. So the first misperception is that people wear corset directly on their skin. People would always wear at least one layer between the skin and the corset, as it was very uncomfortable to wear a corset directly on the skin. A second misconception was that corsets were only worn by very fashionable ladies or high-class ladies. The reality is that we have evidence of women of every condition wearing corsets, from the working in the field to being a servant to being a high-class person. Movies and television series have also portrayed corsets as being always very tight-laced. While there were women that were tight-lacing in an effort to make their waist as small as possible, a majority of women were actually just tightening the corsets to where it felt comfortable. The last myth is that corsets had only an aesthetic role and were only there for fashion. These garments were actually the predecessor of bras, and so they gave support to a woman's bust and a woman's back. To wrap everything up, corsets had multiple functions. They were not only a very fashionable garment, they also had functions in everyday life. People wore it for almost 400 years because it was useful. To conclude, I would like to address why corsets have such a bad rep today. Some modern historians have put out the theory that the reason why we think corsets are very bad stems back from the Victorian era itself. Women were degraded in almost every aspect of their lives, and fashion was the one aspect where women could actually express themselves. And so of course they were put down in that era as well. The narrative actually is that women are too vain for their own good, and they are so shallow that they will just put their life at risk in order to look good. And that's just telling a lot about how misogyny worked in that time. So thanks for listening to this masterclass.